Hey guys, Drifter here. Today I'm back to talk about Call of Duty 2019, but for once we're not going to be focusing on violence or campaign details or story points or something like that. Instead, I want to talk about the new technology employed in this game because Call of Duty Modern Warfare is probably the best looking CoD game that I have ever seen. It's definitely the most realistic looking one. It still runs on the old CoD engine, but it appears to be much more heavily modified than before, and you can make some arguments that it's easier to make a realistic looking game than it is to have one in space or in a cyber world or something like that. But at the end of the day, realistic or not, it is very, very good looking, and I wanted to talk to you about several of the tech upgrades that the developers shared with us. Number one, and I believe most importantly, is that Infinity Ward invented an entirely new polygon rendering engine for the game. It gets 5 times higher poly counts than Infinite Warfare, which would basically mean it has 5 times higher poly counts than any other Call of Duty game. So for example, if we had 5,000 pieces of geometry, then in this new game it would be 25,000 pieces per frame, just as a random example. With far less moving parts on the level, because we're not in space or anything, this means much smoother and better looking objects all around, less bulky, goofy looking ones with less than rounded corners, so to speak. And briefly, it really shows. It was immediately noticeable in the gameplay, and I think it's the most noticeable graphical improvement in the game. The lighting engine is entirely new, and it has a big focus on volumetric lighting and particle scattering effects like dust and fog and gun smoke and all the clutter that kind of gets in your face when you're blowing things up and shooting things. It's also dynamic, so let's say you go into a house and you decide to shoot a whole bunch of plates, you send particles in the air, and that affects not only the regular lighting but also your night vision goggles. As I have been told, there are no more static studio lights where they would just kind of like affix a fictional light somewhere too far away from you for you to see and just blast it into the map from that direction. It's all much more realistic map light sources that come from real things that you can interact with and shoot them out and turn the switches off and stuff like that. One developer said that the game had real-time reflections, and they showed off some of the reflections in Piccadilly, but they did not clarify if this was RTX or not. I assume that it's not RTX because that's a next-gen console feature, and even my current 2080 Ti struggles to run it when I turn on RTX, and it's designed for RTX, so it's probably more like static reflections, which is still a nice improvement, but it's not quite RTX. As a slight change of pace, let's talk about the art design. They left behind the 50 Shades of Brown color palette. That's no more. The old, like, dusty, dirty brown CoD game is going to be a thing of the past. Now they have a much more realistic color palette that's going to vary pretty significantly by region and by map that you play on. For instance, downtown London is a lot more colorful than Vegastan. You know, just that's how that's going to be. The art focus is on realism above all other things, to the point where developers studied garbage and scanned rubbish heaps in their fancy 3D scanning software to help get the most accurate rubble and garbage and debris possible. Corpses have been redone in the game to look more real, which is basically modeling them after live leak videos and real actors that they had fall over and lay down. It's because when people fall over and die, sometimes it's in goofier poses. Their muscles aren't contracting, so their body stretches and their skin does weird things. So there's a lot more realistic corpses if that's just what you're into, you know. And several campaign levels have also been redesigned at 1-to-1 room scale. So most video games make things a little bit not exactly to scale, taller ceilings, bigger doors. For instance, in PUBG, when the game went to first-person mode, everybody noticed that light switches were almost taller than they were, but when they're in third-person mode, it's not. And it was just sort of a camera angle problem that putting the light switches higher looked better and more real in third-person and not in first. So the developers just said, screw all that. Some of these levels are going to be perfectly 1-to-1, and we're not doing video game scaling. And those missions also have more penetratable surfaces than normal for Call of Duty, more destructible things and more interactable things like shooting various stuff into the map to kick up dust, blowing through walls, or turning off lights and water and stuff like that. All of the characters are 100% face captured and bodysuit captured for every single scene. None of them are animated or rigged or are invented characters. All of the characters look and sound exactly like their respective voice actors because they did the whole face capture technology thing. So overall, they look pretty good. Some of the better looking faces in Call of Duty that I've seen in a long time, but facial details is one area where the Call of Duty engine still struggles. It's still not the best optimized for that. They also put a significant amount of work into new clothing to make it look less stiff, because soldiers tend to carry a lot of gear, from ghillie suits to tactical ponchos to huge backpacks and radios and all sorts of attachments on their belt or their weapons that dingle and dangle and flop and kind of jiggle all around when you're running. Previously, COD soldiers are pretty stiff looking guys. They had all their stuff strapped down really tight maybe, but gone are those days. We have much more realistic looking fabrics and clothing items, so it looks great. And finally, Infinity Ward also recreated several different types of night vision goggles. This to me was one of the most impressive things. They also recreated drone cams, AC-130 cams, vehicle cams, street cams, all sorts of cams, and the goal on these was to be as real as possible, and each one of them's a little bit different. So for example, for night vision goggles, they did 3 different generations of this technology. You have this really old, like Gen 1 1960s stolen from Israel night vision goggles that the terrorists use, and then you have some better ones that Russians use, and then you have some truly like bleeding edge next gen full color ones that like the Americans use, and it gets better along the way. But it's not just that there's 3 generations of them, but that they studied raw output files from the cameras and from drones and from all these other sources like the AC-130 videos on YouTube. They went and not just downloaded the video, but they got the original files, like the old raw files and the codecs, so that they could see what resolution it was outputting in, what frame rate it was outputting in, what if it's stretched or distorted, or if it had any sort of weird codec issues. And they even put work into recreating MJPEG artifacting that occurs on some of these devices to make them look just like the ones that you see on YouTube. And finally, there's a massive overhaul to the sound engine. The biggest part of this is that it includes reverb. So reverb, it's almost like a physics, echo would be a good way to say it. It's like a physics engine that reflects all the sound that you shoot in an urban environment back around several times until it dissipates. It was programmed very realistically. It's designed to all run at the speed of sound and run as physics-based instead of programmed per level, so that it just works in whatever environment they put it in. They have bullet casings that hit real objects, which is interesting. So for example, if you're standing in the middle of the street and you shoot, your bullet casings will fall and hit the concrete. Or if you're standing next to a stop sign and you shoot and they go over and hit the stop sign, they'll have a metal ping both louder and sooner than falling to the ground. So it's very kind of a different feeling, like you shoot your shotgun and pump it and then you can hear the shell hit something. It hit a hardwood floor is different than carpet. And that's really neat that each bullet casing has its own sound. It really kind of adds to the realism. There was work done to the guns as well. All of the guns have smoke and moving parts, and they put oil layers because they went shooting with actual real soldiers and former and current operators and stuff, and they learned a lot about cleaning guns and oiling them. And when you see guns in real life, they aren't exactly perfectly smooth. They're usually a little oily and a little greasy because you need to keep them well running. And they even have like a little rainbow kind of effect going through them, so that's in the game. There's smoke, there's a whole variety of sights that all look different and real. Now the sight technology they did actually scale back on a little bit, because Call of Duty Ghosts had this crazy double rendering thing going on. They don't have double rendering. They're not going to double render the engine for the scopes, but they do something similar that works almost as well, that doesn't punish the engine quite as much. So overall, Call of Duty Modern Warfare is the best looking COD in ages. Best looking game has to be relative to when it was made. Newer games should look better than old ones. But I think I would be safe to say, and I believe that most of the people that were there with me would agree, that it is the best looking Call of Duty game that I have ever seen. There are still some weak points in the graphics because the Call of Duty engine is old, and while it's not an entirely new engine, it's just an improved one. I did notice some flaws, but I have a very critical eye. I look for frames, I look for all sorts of really, really tiny details, and how polygons are handled, and how meshes are handled, and how light reflections work, and etc., etc. And if I sit there and study it, I can see some of the struggle bussy things that are left in the old engine. But I think that given the improvement, especially in the geometry and lighting and sound and stuff, that the vast majority of players will overlook them entirely and not notice whatsoever. Guys, I hope that you enjoyed this video. I hope that you learned something useful. If you did, don't forget to like, favorite, and subscribe. Drifter out.
Are you okay? No, stressed. I know, buddy. Oh, I know it's scary.